The year 1887 marked a turning point. The United States government passed the General Allotment Act, known as the Dawes Act. Sponsored by Senator Henry L. Dawes, it aimed to assimilate Native Americans into mainstream society. The act sought to dismantle communal land ownership, a core aspect of Native life. Tribes held land collectively, but the act proposed dividing it into individual parcels. Each Native American head of household would receive a plot, usually 160 acres. The government believed this would teach Native Americans about private property and self-sufficiency. The ultimate goal was assimilation, erasing distinct cultures. But behind these intentions lay a more complex reality. The Dawes Act was also about land. Vast amounts of native land were at stake, desired by many white Americans. The act provided a legal mechanism for transferring land from native control to white control. The promise of assimilation often masked the reality of dispossession. The shadow of this act would stretch long, impacting generations of Native people. To implement the Dawes Act, the government had to identify who was eligible for land allotments. This led to the creation of the Dawes Rolls, official lists of tribal members. The Dawes Commission, established in 1893, aimed to convince certain tribes to accept allotment. These tribes were the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole nations. The process of creating the Dawes Rolls was painstaking and often flawed. Commission members traveled to Indian Territory, setting up enrollment centers and interviewing thousands. People had to prove their native ancestry and membership in one of the 5 tribes. This was difficult for many, as oral traditions were strong and written records scarce. The commission demanded specific kinds of proof, often misaligned with tribal ways of knowing kinship. The final rolls, completed in 1907, contained over 101,000 names. These individuals were deemed entitled to an allotment of land. However, the rolls were far from perfect, excluding many legitimate tribal members. The Dawes Rolls became a definitive record, used to distribute land and determine future tribal membership. This act of listing and categorizing was an act of power, reshaping internal tribal identities. The primary purpose of the Dawes Rolls was to facilitate the division of communally held tribal lands. Once enrolled, individuals received their allotted parcel, varying in size based on family status and treaty agreements. The idea was that each enrolled member would become a private landowner, encouraging farming and a settled lifestyle. After all eligible individuals received their allotments, vast tracts of tribal land often remained. This surplus land was opened up for sale to non-native settlers, a key objective for many supporters of the act. The sale of surplus lands generated revenue, but little of it directly benefited the tribes sustainably. The Dawes Rolls were supposed to ensure fairness, identifying legitimate tribal members to prevent fraud. However, defining identity through bureaucratic lists was problematic, reducing complex tribal identity to a set of criteria. The process was rife with inconsistencies and injustices, often leading to broken promises. Ultimately, the Dawes Rolls served the government's broader agenda of land acquisition and assimilation. By individualizing land ownership, the act weakened tribal cohesion, making it easier for land to pass out of native hands. Amidst the Dawes enrollment, a disturbing phenomenon emerged: the rise of the so-called $5 Indians. These were predominantly white individuals who sought enrollment by falsely claiming Native American ancestry. The term $5 Indian likely came from the cost of a lawyer, a fraudulent affidavit, or a bribe. These individuals were motivated by the desire for land, as Indian Territory held valuable resources. They had to falsify their identity and convince the Dawes Commission of their native heritage. The methods varied, from fabricating family trees to relying on false testimony. The Dawes Commission, overwhelmed and under pressure, often had inadequate verification procedures. Many fraudulent claims slipped through the cracks, diverting land intended for legitimate tribal members. This further diluted the already shrinking tribal land base and created deep resentment within Native communities. The term $5 Indian became a derogatory label, symbolizing the corruption and injustice of the allotment era. The success of $5 Indians in gaining land hinged on several factors. The Dawes Commission's process was often ill-equipped to handle the complexities of Native identity. Commissioners, lacking deep understanding of tribal kinship systems, relied heavily on written documents and sworn testimonies. The burden of proof often fell on the applicant, but standards for proof were inconsistent. Weak verification and limited resources created loopholes for fraud. The commission faced pressure from politicians, land speculators, and railroad companies to complete the rolls swiftly. This rush often meant claims were not thoroughly investigated. Some officials were reportedly corrupt, accepting bribes to approve questionable applications. $5 Indians often paid individuals to provide false affidavits attesting to their supposed native ancestry. The impact on legitimate tribal members was severe, as many struggled to prove their own heritage. The infiltration of the rolls by $5 Indians was an act of theft, compounding the injustices of the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act had a catastrophic impact on Native American land ownership. Before the act, Native nations collectively held vast territories, the basis of their cultures and economies. The act aimed to break this up, and it succeeded dramatically. Native Americans lost about 90 million acres of land, roughly two-thirds of their total land base. Allotments were often held in trust by the government for 25 years, supposedly to protect native landowners. But after the trust period, landowners received full title and could sell their land. Many were pressured or tricked into selling, and poverty forced sales. The sale of surplus lands, open to white settlers, was another major cause of land loss. The proceeds from these sales were often mismanaged or insufficient to compensate for the loss. The result was a fragmented pattern of land ownership, undermining tribal governance and sovereignty. The loss of land had devastating economic consequences, pushing many native communities into deeper poverty. The Dawes Act and the Dawes Rolls did more than strip Native Americans of their land. The policies tore at the fabric of Native societies, undermining traditional governance structures. Tribal councils and leaders saw their authority diminished as the U.S. government imposed new forms of organization. The focus shifted from the collective to the individual, assaulting long-standing cultural values. The emphasis on individual land ownership eroded communal bonds and pitted family members against each other. The enrollment process created lasting divisions, with disputes over legitimate tribal membership. The rolls, often inaccurate, became the basis for determining citizenship, leading to exclusion and resentment. The introduction of blood quantum further complicated matters, affecting tribal identity and enrollment. The loss of land led to economic despair, contributing to social problems like health and education. The forced assimilation policies aimed to erase Native identity, inflicting deep trauma. The Dawes Rolls were a tool for social engineering, fracturing communities and disorienting individuals. The Dawes Act was a crucial component of American colonization and westward expansion. From the earliest encounters, European powers and the United States sought to acquire native lands and control native peoples. The Dawes Act represented a new phase in this ongoing effort, shifting tactics but maintaining the same underlying goal. The ideology of manifest destiny fueled much of this expansion, portraying Native Americans as obstacles. Assimilation policies like the Dawes Act were presented as benevolent but masked a brutal agenda of cultural destruction and land expropriation. The act aimed to destroy tribalism, imposing individualism and private property as cornerstones of the American way. This policy was a form of cultural genocide, seeking to eradicate native languages, religions, and social structures. Boarding schools, another tool of assimilation, worked in tandem with the Dawes Act, attacking the cultural base. Together, they represented a concerted effort to eliminate Native Americans as distinct peoples. The act was a legal instrument of conquest, using the language of property rights to achieve colonial ends. The Dawes Act and the Dawes Rolls cast a long dark shadow over Native American history. The immediate impact was the catastrophic loss of land, impoverishing countless families and communities. The act shattered social structures, undermining traditional forms of governance and attacking Native identity. The promise of assimilation led to marginalization, not integration. The legacy of the Dawes Rolls is complex, as they are now used by many tribes to determine citizenship. This reliance perpetuates historical injustices, fueling debates about identity and belonging. Despite the devastation, Native nations have shown remarkable resilience, fighting to retain their languages, cultures, and traditions. They continue to assert their sovereignty, reclaiming lands and rebuilding communities. Understanding the dark history of the Dawes Act is crucial for recognizing contemporary issues facing Native Americans. Reflecting on this history is essential for building a more just and equitable future. The echoes of dispossession still resonate today, and we must listen to them.